Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband accidentally left his laptop open. I saw 1,200 messages and photos with my own sister. They had been betraying me behind my back. I silently closed the laptop and texted my sister, "Come for dinner tomorrow." When she appeared at my door, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was one of the lucky ones. That's the thought that haunts me most now. Not the betrayal itself, but how genuinely, embarrassingly certain I was that my life was good, solid, real. I was 38 years old, living in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. I had a husband who brought me coffee before I even got out of bed. I had a sister who called me every Sunday without fail. I had a career I'd built from nothing. 12 years as a project manager at a mid-size architecture firm, a title on my business cards, a savings account that didn't keep me up at night. I had, or so I believed, the two most important relationships in my life locked down tight. My name is Claire, and I was a fool. Marcus and I had been married for 9 years. We met at a work conference in Chicago. He was in corporate finance, sharp and funny, and just arrogant enough to be interesting. We dated for 2 years, got married on a Saturday in October when the leaves were turning, and built something I would have called a partnership. Not passionate in the way of movies, but honest. Steady. He remembered my dry cleaning. I proofread his presentations. We had inside jokes and a shared Netflix queue and a standing dinner reservation at a little Italian place downtown every anniversary. I thought that was enough. I thought that was everything. My sister Diane was 3 years younger than me. She'd always been the beautiful one. People said it to our faces growing up, as if it were a compliment to one of us and a simple fact about the other. She was a freelance photographer, perpetually between relationships, always borrowing money she eventually paid back. We were close in the complicated way sisters are when one has more and the other pretends not to notice. She came to our house often. Marcus had always seemed to tolerate her the way husbands tolerate their wives' families, with patience and mild boredom. Or so I thought. The first sign, when I look back, came 8 months before everything fell apart. It was a Thursday evening in January. I came home from work early with a migraine, something I almost never did, and Diane's car was in the driveway. That wasn't unusual. She had a key, she dropped by sometimes. But when I walked in, the house felt strange. Too quiet in the way a house is quiet when people have recently stopped talking. Diane was in the kitchen, making tea with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Marcus was in the living room, on his phone. "You're home early," he said, without looking up. "Headache," I said. Diane turned and smiled at me. It was a perfectly normal smile. That was the thing about it. It was too normal, the way an actor smiles when they've rehearsed the expression. I took 2 Advil and went upstairs. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was tired. I had a headache. I let it go. The second sign came in March. We were at my parents' house for Easter dinner, the whole family around the table, and I watched Marcus pass the bread basket to Diane. Nothing. A bread basket. But his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them looked at each other afterward. Which is exactly what people do when they are actively, consciously choosing not to look at each other. I know that now. Then I speared a piece of asparagus and told myself I was imagining things. By May, Marcus had started going to the gym at odd hours. 6 in the morning on Saturdays, 10 at night on Tuesdays. He'd always been moderately active, so I didn't raise it. But he started leaving his phone face down on tables. He started laughing at things on his screen and then tilting it away when I walked by. Small things. The kind of things that don't add up to anything by themselves and add up to everything together. I didn't want to know. That's the honest truth. I sensed it, the way you sense bad weather before the sky changes, and I chose not to look directly at it. Because knowing would mean the end of something I wasn't ready to lose. And then came the Tuesday in June that changed everything. I had left work early. A client meeting had been canceled last minute. I came home to an empty house, or what I thought was an empty house. Marcus's car was gone. I went upstairs to change, and on the way back down, I passed his home office. The door was open. His laptop was on his desk, the screen still glowing, because he'd forgotten to close it when he left in a hurry. I wasn't going to look. I was going to walk past. I didn't walk past. The browser was open to a messaging app I didn't recognize at first. Not WhatsApp, not iMessage, something third party, downloaded specifically, I would later understand, for its disappearing message feature. Except, he hadn't let the messages disappear. There were 1,247 of them. I stood and counted. I don't know why I counted. My hands were completely steady, which frightened me more than if they'd been shaking. Photos, messages, timestamps going back 11 months. My husband, my sister. I stood in that doorway for a long time, long enough for the screen to dim. I reached out and pressed one key to keep it lit, and I read, and I looked, and something inside me went very, very still. Then I closed the laptop, slowly, quietly, as if I didn't want to disturb anything. I walked to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and typed a text to Diane. "Come for dinner tomorrow, just us. I'm making that pasta you like." She replied in 4 minutes with a heart emoji. I put the phone down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. Our backyard, with the garden I'd planted 3 summers ago and the patio furniture we'd picked out together. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I am not going to cry yet. First, I am going to think. I didn't sleep that night. Marcus came home at 7:30, kissed me on the cheek, said he'd grabbed a burger on the way back, asked how my day was. I told him it was fine. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table while he scrolled through his phone on the couch, and I watched him the way you watch something you're studying, clinically, from a remove. And I thought, who are you, exactly? I'd been trying to answer that question for 9 years, and apparently hadn't come close. When he went upstairs to shower, I sat with the silence and began, very deliberately, to take stock. Not of my feelings. I would get to those later, I promised myself. But of my situation, the facts of it, the math of it. Because this wasn't just a personal catastrophe. This was a financial, legal, and logistical problem that would require clear thinking to survive. And I was not going to let grief make me stupid. We owned the house jointly. We had 2 bank accounts, one personal each, one joint. The joint account had a little over $40,000 in it, money we'd been saving for a renovation we'd talked about for years and never started. My personal account had around $18,000. I didn't know exactly what was in Marcus's personal account, but I knew he earned more than I did. Considerably more, about $140,000 a year to my 90. And I knew that in Ohio, marital assets were subject to equitable distribution in a divorce. I had been careful over 9 years to contribute equally to our life. Mortgage payments, utilities, vacations, the new roof 2 years ago. I had documentation. I kept records. That was, I realized, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, going to matter enormously. I thought about Diane, my sister, the one who'd been in my wedding, who was the first person I'd called when I miscarried at 11 weeks, 3 years into our marriage, and Marcus held my hand but didn't know what to say. Who knew things about me that I had never told another living soul? Who had eaten at this table, slept in the guest room upstairs, borrowed my car, cried on my shoulder after her own breakups? Who had been in my house, in my life, for 35 years? How long had it been going on? The messages went back 11 months, but the messages were what I'd seen, not what might have existed before on different platforms since deleted. Could it have been longer? The thought moved through me like ice water. I didn't let myself spiral into it. Not yet. What I let myself feel, sitting there alone in the kitchen, was something that surprised me. Not the grief I'd expected, but a cold, quiet anger. The kind of anger that doesn't make you want to scream. The kind that makes you want to win. Because here was what I understood with absolute clarity in that midnight kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the shower running upstairs. If I confronted them now, in shock, in tears, with nothing but what I'd glimpsed on a laptop screen, I would have nothing. Marcus would deny it. He'd close accounts, move money, construct a story. Diane would weep and perform remorse and fracture my concentration with her tears. I would be the devastated wife in the corner while they managed the narrative. I had seen it happen to other women. I was not going to be that woman. I needed documentation. I needed legal counsel before I said a single word. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with, financially and practically, before I fired a single shot. And I needed Diane to come to dinner the next evening. Not so I could confront her. Not yet. So I could watch her. So I could read her face across my dinner table and confirm, with my own eyes, what I already knew. So I could begin. The plan formed slowly, and then all at once, the way plans do when your back is against a wall and something primal takes over. It had several stages. First, gather. Second, protect. Third, act. And not one stage before the other. Not one step out of order, no matter how much every instinct I had screamed at me to walk upstairs and wake Marcus up and say I know. I went to my home office, my own room, my own desk, my own computer, and I opened a new document. At the top, I typed one line: what I know, what I need, what I will do. Then I started writing. By 2 a.m, I had 3 pages. By 3, I had a name, recommended by a colleague 2 years ago after her own divorce, a family law attorney named Patricia Wren, known for being methodical and relentless. I had written down every financial asset I could account for. I had noted the date range of the messages I'd seen, the platform, and every detail I could recall from the images. I had written down every instance, going back months, that now seemed like a signal I'd missed. And I had made one decision, the most important one. I would not change my behavior toward Marcus, not by 1 degree. I would be exactly who I'd been that morning, the wife who handed him coffee, who asked about his meetings, who moved through this house as if nothing had shifted on its axis. I would give him no warning, none. Diane was coming for dinner in less than 18 hours. I closed the document, encrypted it with a password Marcus didn't know, and went to bed. I even slept. Diane arrived at 6:15 with a bottle of Pinot Grigio and a new haircut. I noticed the haircut. It was the kind of small, careful thing a woman does when she wants to look better than usual. Not dramatically different, just a little more deliberate. Her highlights were fresh. She'd put effort into her face. I noticed all of it, and I said, "You look great." And she smiled and said she'd needed a change, and I uncorked the wine. We ate at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us. Marcus was traveling, or so he'd told me that morning, some kind of client thing in Cincinnati. I nodded and packed a lunch and kissed him goodbye. And the moment his car left the driveway, I stood in the doorway and felt the silence of the house settle around me, like something I was going to have to learn to live in. Dinner with Diane lasted 2 hours. She talked about a photography project, a difficult client, a man she'd been seeing casually who wasn't returning her texts with sufficient enthusiasm. I listened. I asked questions. I refilled her glass. And I watched her the way I'd watched Marcus the night before, carefully from behind the ordinary surface of myself. What did I see? I saw a woman who was performing ease. There was a half-second delay before her smiles, the kind that comes when the smile is constructed rather than arrived at. She touched her hair twice when I mentioned Marcus's name. Not flirtatiously, nervously. She ate less than she usually did. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual, and her arms were tight in a way that felt like apology. And I stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear and thought, she knows I know nothing, and she feels guilty anyway, and that guilt is going to be useful. The next morning, I called Patricia Wren's office before 8 a.m. She saw me that Thursday. Her office was in a mid-rise downtown, the kind of space that projects competence without warmth. Good furniture, no personal photographs, a clean desk with exactly 3 items on it. Patricia Wren was 52, trim, and had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of the story I was about to tell, and found all of them equally solvable. That steadiness was the most comforting thing I had encountered in 3 days. I told her everything. She took notes. She asked specific questions. The platform, the nature of the content, the duration suggested by the timestamps, the financial structure of the marriage. She asked if there were children. There weren't. She asked if there were prenuptial agreements. There weren't. She asked if I had independent documentation of the marital assets. I handed her the 3-page document I'd written at 2 in the morning. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at me. You wrote this the night you found out? Yes. Good, she said. That's very good. She explained to me that what I'd seen on the laptop, a glimpse, not photographed, not screenshotted, just observed, was a starting point but not sufficient. I needed documentation that could be verified. She recommended a digital forensics consultant her firm worked with regularly, a man named Gary Ostroff, who specialized in recovering data from devices and accounts in family law cases. She also advised me strongly, do not confront, do not change financial behavior, do not discuss this with anyone I was not certain of. That last point was the hardest. I had 3 close friends. I trusted all of them. But Patricia's point was clean and practical. Every person I told before the process was protected was a possible leak, and a leak would give Marcus time to move assets. I didn't tell anyone, but Marcus was already beginning to feel something. It started, I think, because of the laptop. He must have noticed it had been moved, not by much, but enough. He didn't say anything to me directly, but that weekend, when he came back from Cincinnati, he was slightly different. Slightly more attentive, the way people become attentive when they're monitoring something. He asked me twice how I was feeling. He suggested we go out for dinner on Saturday. He complimented my cooking on Sunday. Small recalibrations, easy to miss. I accepted them all gracefully and felt nothing except a growing resolve. The documented evidence arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after I'd first walked into Patricia's office. Gary Ostroff had worked with the information I'd provided, the platform name, the approximate time frame, and a legal process through Marcus's public email account that had been part of our joint business correspondence. What he found was not illegal to obtain in the way it had been generated, and Patricia had cleared the method beforehand. She called me into her office and placed a printed file on the desk between us. 14 months of communication, not 11. 14. I sat with that number for a moment. There's more, Patricia said. She turned to a specific page. A transfer of funds. $6,000, moved out of an account I hadn't known Marcus had maintained separately. a secondary account he'd opened 4 years into our marriage, to an address in Clintonville. I looked up the address when I got home. It was an apartment building. The lease, which Gary had found through property records, was in Diane's name. Marcus had been helping pay my sister's rent. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I drove home. Not crying, just sitting. 14 months, I thought. A secret apartment. My money, our money, going to her. The point of no return wasn't the laptop. This was. The divorce petition was filed on a Wednesday morning in July. I know the exact date because I'd chosen it deliberately. Marcus had a major client presentation that afternoon, one he'd been preparing for weeks, and I knew he wouldn't see the notification until evening. Patricia had advised me that under Ohio law, once the petition was filed, certain automatic restraining orders would go into effect immediately. Neither party could transfer, sell, or dissipate marital assets. His hands would be tied before he even knew the game had started. That morning, I had also done 3 other things. I had moved my personal savings to a new account at a different bank. I had taken copies, physical copies, stored in a fireproof box at Patricia's office, of every financial document I had access to. Tax returns for 8 years, mortgage statements, investment account summaries, both are W-2s. And I had quietly begun the process of refinancing my standing on the joint mortgage, a technical step my attorney said would protect my long-term credit position regardless of outcome. I went to work after the filing. I sat at my desk. I responded to emails. I ate lunch at my desk. I was extraordinarily, almost eerily calm. Marcus found out at 6:47 that evening. I know this because that was when my phone rang, his name on the screen, and I let it ring twice, took a breath, and answered. "What did you do?" Not a question. Flat and hard. "I filed for divorce," I said. "You'll receive formal notice from my attorney." A pause. "Claire, whatever you think you—" "I have 14 months of documentation, Marcus. I have the transfer records. I know about the apartment." I kept my voice level. "Patricia Wren is representing me. She'll be in touch." I hung up. For 30 seconds, the phone was quiet. Then it rang again, and then again, and then it stopped. He came home. I heard his car at 8 o'clock, the garage door, the key in the lock. I was in the living room with a book I wasn't reading. He came in still in his work clothes, and he looked like a man who'd had a very bad few hours, face tight, eyes moving too quickly, jaw working. "We need to talk," he said. "My attorney has advised me not to have unmediated conversation about the terms," I said pleasantly. "If you have something to say, you can communicate through Patricia's office." "You are not doing this." His voice went up an octave. "Do you understand what this means? What this will cost? The house. We'll have to sell the house, Claire. We'll lose everything we built." "I've reviewed the asset division with my attorney," I said. "I'm satisfied with the projected outcome." He stared at me. I could see him recalibrating in real time, trying to find the angle, the lever. "This is about Diane," he said. "My attorney will be in touch," I said. He slept in the guest room that night. Or didn't sleep. I heard him on his phone until after 2. Diane called me the next morning at 9. I had been waiting for this. Her voice was different from Marcus's. Not hard, but fractured. The kind of voice that comes with genuine distress rather than calculation. She said she needed to see me. She said she was so sorry. She said she'd been trying to end it, that it meant nothing, that she knew there was no excuse, that she would do anything. "Diane," I said quietly, "I'll be communicating through my attorney. If you have anything to say, you can reach Patricia Wren." "Claire, please, I'm your sister." "I know," I said. And I ended the call. That was when they escalated. 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, both of them appeared at the door together. I saw them through the front window before they knocked. Standing on my porch, Marcus in a jacket, Diane in a dress, a unified front. My stomach tightened, but I went to the door. Marcus spoke first. He'd clearly prepared. He said there was no need for legal action. He said he was willing to enter counseling, to be transparent, to address whatever I needed. He said the apartment was a mistake, the money was an error in judgment, that it was over with Diane and had been for months. Diane's eyes were red. She said she would disappear from our lives entirely. She said she would move cities if that's what it took. Then Marcus shifted. And this was the part I'd been braced for. He said, quietly and with precision, "You know the Hargrove contracts are jointly structured. If this becomes a public divorce filing, the audit triggers. That affects both of us." I looked at him. "Are you threatening me, Marcus?" "I'm outlining consequences," he said, "for both of us." "Then I'll let Patricia outline my response," I said. "You can leave now." "Claire, you can leave now." They left. I closed the door, put my back against it, and breathed. He had just tried to use a business contract clause to frighten me into silence. He didn't know, couldn't know, that I had already discussed the Hargrove structure with Patricia 3 days prior. The audit risk was real but manageable, and my liability was limited by the documentation trail I'd maintained. He had used his one threat, and it had not landed. I took the next 4 days almost entirely off. I told my office I was dealing with a family matter. I drove to a small lake outside the city where my family had rented a cabin when I was a child, and I sat on the dock in the evenings, and I let myself feel some of what I had been deferring. The grief was real. I'd loved Marcus, or believed I had. I'd loved Diane my whole life. But I didn't mistake grief for weakness. I came home on Thursday, ready to continue. The attempts didn't stop. They just changed shape. Marcus, in the weeks that followed, cycled through approaches with the persistence of someone who'd realized that blunt confrontation hadn't worked and was now running experiments. First came the tenderness. Texts at odd hours, the kind we'd exchanged in the early years of our marriage. Just thinking about us, about what we built. "I know I destroyed it, but I need you to know it was real." I read each one once and did not respond. I forwarded them to Patricia. Then came the practical appeal. A long email, formatted almost like a business proposal, outlining the financial logic of reconciliation, the projected costs of divorce proceedings, the division of the house, the disruption to both our careers. He'd run the numbers. It was, I had to admit, a well-constructed document. I sent it to Patricia with a note. "He's frightened about the money." She confirmed that the filing had triggered his attention in exactly the way she'd anticipated. Diane's approach was different and harder to dismiss, because Diane knew me the way only a sister does. She didn't call again after I'd asked her not to. But she sent cards. Physical cards. Handwritten. Dropped in my mailbox. Not through the postal service, which meant she was driving to my neighborhood and approaching my house. The first card said only, "I am so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know." The second said, "I dream about you, about us when we were kids. I know I don't deserve to ask you anything." The third had a photograph tucked inside, a photo I didn't know she'd kept, of the two of us at maybe 6 and 9 in our backyard in Indiana, squinting into the summer sun. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then I put it in a drawer, and I did not respond to any of the cards. Was it cruel? Maybe. But I had learned, in the weeks since that Tuesday in June, that my softness was the exact thing they were counting on. Every time they reached for me, Marcus with logic, Diane with memory, they were reaching for the woman who'd always found it easier to forgive than to fight. They were betting she was still there. She was. She was just standing behind bulletproof glass. What I needed, what I recognized I needed, with the same clarity that had gotten me through the filing, was people who knew and who were mine. Not to help me strategize, just to stand beside me. I told 3 people. The first was my colleague and closest friend at work, a woman named Renata, 10 years older than me, who had gone through her own divorce 6 years ago and come out of it harder and kinder in equal measure. I told her on a Tuesday over lunch, outside at a picnic table by the parking lot, and she listened to all of it without interrupting. And when I finished, she put her hand on the table near mine, not quite touching, and said, "You did everything exactly right." That was all I needed to hear. The second was my college roommate, Jess, who lived in Portland and who I called on a Sunday night. She cried when I told her about Diane. Not me, her. She cried for 10 minutes while I sat quietly on my end of the phone, and there was something releasing about having someone else carry some of the weight of it. The third was a therapist. Patricia had recommended family therapy referrals. I chose one independently. A woman named Dr. Sandra Obi, who specialized in trauma responses to betrayal. I saw her every Thursday at noon. I did not perform okayness in those sessions. I said things out loud that I'd been keeping below language, and it was brutal and necessary, and I left each appointment feeling scraped clean, which is different from feeling better, but is, I came to understand, the required step before better. I also found, through Dr. Obi's referrals, a small support group. Not a formal one. 6 women, a facilitator, a conference room in a church basement on alternating Tuesdays. Women in various stages of what I was going through. Some freshly devastated, some 2 years out and almost unrecognizable in their solidity. I listened more than I talked in those first weeks. But I listened hard. One thing the women in that group said, in various ways, again and again: they will come back when they think you've had time to soften. I filed that away. In the meantime, Marcus had gone to stay at a corporate apartment his company kept for traveling employees. He was still in Columbus, still in contact through attorneys only, still sending the occasional text that I forwarded without responding. Diane had, according to mutual family contacts, told our parents that Marcus and I were going through a rough patch, a fiction so extraordinary in its smallness that when my mother called, worried and confused, I had to spend 40 minutes on the phone quietly dismantling it. My parents were devastated about Diane. My mother wept. My father said almost nothing, which from him was more eloquent than speech. I told them I was managing, that I had good people around me, that I was not going to be okay immediately, but that I was going to be okay. I believed it more every day. Marcus and Diane, from what I could gather, were in a holding pattern, watching to see how far I'd go, waiting for a crack. Patricia confirmed that Marcus's attorney had requested a settlement meeting 3 times. She had declined each one, per our strategy. "We're not meeting until we're ready," she told me, "and we're not ready until the asset picture is complete." It was getting complete. And the women on those Tuesday evenings had been right. They would come back. They came on a Saturday in September. I'd known something was coming for about a week. There had been a subtle shift in the pattern. Marcus's texts had stopped entirely, which meant he'd moved to a new strategy. Diane's cards had stopped too. When people who've been making noise go suddenly quiet, it doesn't mean they've given up. It means they've been planning. My doorbell rang at 11 in the morning. I looked through the window. Marcus and Diane again, but different from the last time. That visit had been urgent, disheveled. This one had been dressed. They were both composed, almost formal. Marcus had flowers. Actual flowers, a proper arrangement wrapped in craft paper. Diane was carrying a casserole dish. I took a breath, and I opened the door. "We're not here to argue," Marcus said immediately, his voice measured. "We just want to talk, please." I let them in. I want to be honest about that decision. I let them in because I'd discussed exactly this scenario with Patricia and Dr. Obi, and I understood that refusing them entry would only delay it, and I was prepared enough to hear what they'd come to say. We sat in the living room. I offered no coffee. I sat in the chair across from the couch where they'd chosen to sit together, not touching, but together, and I folded my hands and waited. Marcus spoke first, and he was good. He was very, very good, and I say that not as a compliment, but as a clinical observation, the way you might note the competence of someone who is doing something harmful. He acknowledged the affair in full. He used the right language. He didn't minimize, didn't deflect. Named it clearly: a betrayal, a violation of trust, a fundamental breach of everything we'd committed to. He said he had entered therapy. He named his therapist. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, and that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking only for the chance to make things financially whole without a lengthy court process, which he said, and here his voice shifted just slightly, just enough, would be difficult for both of us, especially professionally, given certain shared contracts. There it was, wrapped in sincerity, but there it was. I kept my face even. Then Diane spoke. Diane was harder to listen to than Marcus because Diane's pain was real. I knew how to read her, 35 years of her face. And what I saw wasn't performance. She was genuinely suffering. She said she'd been in love with him for 2 years before anything physical happened, that she'd hated herself the entire time, that she'd tried to stop twice. She said she'd grown up in my shadow her whole life and that it had made her do something monstrous. She said she wasn't asking for anything. She just wanted me to know the truth. Part of me wanted to reach for her. That part was real, and I didn't shame it. But I looked at the casserole dish on my coffee table, the flowers on the end table, the way they'd arrived together, rehearsed, each playing their role. The whole composition of the visit, the timing, the presentation, the sequence of speakers, was too arranged to be spontaneous. This had been discussed, coordinated, shaped for maximum effect. What they wanted was for me to agree to a private settlement. No court, no judge, no public record. A quiet dissolution that would protect Marcus's professional standing, preserve certain business structures, and limit the documentation that a full proceeding would generate. They would split things fairly, they said. More than fairly? He named a number that was genuinely generous. I could walk away whole, financially. I said, "I appreciate you both coming." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I won't be accepting a private settlement," I said. "My attorney will continue to represent me through the formal process." The change in Marcus's face was small, but complete, like a light switching off behind his eyes. "Claire," his voice had lost the measured quality, "do you understand what a full court proceeding does to both of us? The Hargrove audit was just one piece. There are other contracts with disclosure clauses. This will blow up things that don't need to be blown up." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that," I said, 14 months ago. Diane put her hand over her mouth. "You're doing this out of anger," Marcus said. And now there was something harder in his voice, the edge I'd felt on the porch in July. "You want to hurt me. That's what this is." "No," I said. "I want what's legally and equitably mine. Those are two different things." He stood up. "You're making a mistake." "You can discuss it with Patricia," I said. I stood too. "I'd like you both to leave now." Diane stood. She didn't say anything else. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite love and wasn't quite grief, but was a combination of all three, and she walked to the door. Marcus paused in the doorway. "You've changed," he said. Yes, I said. I have. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway alone and let the fear come. Because it came. Marcus's words about professional consequences weren't empty. There were real complexities there, real risks I'd discussed with Patricia, outcomes that were not guaranteed in my favor. I wasn't operating from a position of perfect safety. Any honest account of my situation had to include that. But here was what I had discovered. In those months of discipline and preparation, fear, when you don't let it make decisions for you, becomes something else. It becomes a tension. It becomes the thing that keeps your hands steady when everything in you wants to shake. I went to my desk and emailed Patricia. They came. It went as expected. Let's schedule a call for Monday. I want to talk about timeline. The settlement conference was scheduled for October 14th. Patricia had pushed for it on our timeline, not theirs. 3 months of preparation, a complete financial picture, every document sourced and verified, every number checked twice. Marcus's attorney, a man named Gerald Fisk, who had a reputation for aggressive settlements, had been attempting for weeks to move the date earlier or push it later, to find conditions that would shift the playing field. Patricia declined each request with the serene unflappability of someone who held stronger cards and knew it. The conference was held in a neutral location, a conference room at a law firm neither party used on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, with a view I barely registered. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, and a mediator named Howard Kalb, who had been doing this for 23 years and wore an expression of determined neutrality. I arrived 10 minutes early. I wore a dark blue blazer over a gray dress, practical, composed, nothing that invited commentary. I brought a legal pad, 3 pens, and a folder. Patricia sat beside me. On the other side of the table, Marcus, Gerald Fisk, and a second associate I didn't recognize. Diane was not there. She had no legal standing in the divorce proceeding itself. She was, in a sense, the reason for all of this, and not present for any of it, which I thought, sitting down, was its own kind of truth about the whole situation. The conference opened with the mediator's standard framing, a joint effort to reach equitable resolution, both parties encouraged toward good faith negotiation. Gerald Fisk began with what Patricia had predicted, a counter-proposal that substantially undervalued my claim on the house and excluded 2 investment accounts on the grounds that they predated the marriage. Patricia addressed each point in turn. She was not aggressive. She was simply thorough. Every counter was met with a document, a timestamp, a legal precedent. And then we reached the section Patricia had described to me simply as the secondary accounts. She placed a summary on the table. It included the account Marcus had maintained separately, the transaction history, and the specific transfers to the Clintonville address over 14 months. Gerald Fisk began to object, framing issue, method of acquisition, and Patricia, without raising her voice, referenced the legal consultation that had cleared the methodology before Gary Ostroff had undertaken a single search. Howard Kalb reviewed the summary and ruled the documentation admissible. Marcus, across the table, was very still. And then came the detail I had been sitting with for 3 months. Patricia placed a second document beside the first. It was a summary of a financial instrument I had spent considerable time understanding before I allowed it to be introduced. A life insurance policy Marcus had taken out jointly in our names 8 years into our marriage, with a modification made 2 years ago. A small modification, a change to a single clause. He had, without telling me, made himself the sole beneficiary. It had been done quietly, through a broker we'd both signed paperwork with during a refinancing. I'd signed a stack of documents that day, as one does. One of them, buried in the stack, had contained that clause. This was not illegal, strictly speaking. Marital insurance policies have complicated regulations. But it was, Patricia argued, evidence of intent. of a systematic effort to protect his own interests within a marriage he was planning to exit, which spoke directly to the question of good faith in asset disclosure. Gerald Fisk objected. Marcus turned to speak to him in a low, urgent voice. Howard Kalb looked at the document. The room shifted. It was a physical sensation. The air in the room, the alignment of attention. Marcus cleared his throat and said, carefully, that he had intended to discuss that modification with me when the time was appropriate. When the time was appropriate. I wrote it on my legal pad in full. Mr. Calhoun, the mediator said evenly, the purpose of this conference is to determine an equitable distribution of marital assets. If there is documentation indicating that changes to jointly held instruments were made without the co-holder's awareness, that is directly relevant to the question of transparency. It was an oversight, Marcus said. Is that your characterization, formally? Patricia asked. For the record? He looked at me for the first time in a direct way, not the careful monitoring glances of the last months, a direct look. What was in it? I couldn't name it cleanly. Something cornered. Something that hadn't had a name in the years I'd known him, because he'd never needed to show it. Yes, he said. An oversight. Thank you, Patricia said, and made a note. The rest of the session took 4 hours. Marcus's composure degraded in stages. First the careful restraint, then a visible agitation that Gerald Fisk tried twice to contain with a steadying hand on his arm. Then a moment, toward the end, where Marcus interrupted the mediator to say that the entire process was punitive rather than equitable, at which point Howard Kalb asked him quietly to allow his attorney to speak on his behalf. When we broke for 15 minutes midway through the afternoon, I walked to the window at the end of the hall and stood looking out at Columbus. The skyline, the river in the distance, the ordinary afternoon light on buildings I'd looked at for 12 years. I felt something I hadn't entirely anticipated. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter and more durable. I had come to this room with the truth, and the truth had been enough. Patricia came to stand beside me. You doing okay? Yes, I said. Are we where we need to be? We're ahead of where we needed to be, she said. We went back in. The agreement was finalized on November 3rd. I remember the date because it was a Monday, gray and cold, and I drove to Patricia's office alone and signed 4 pages of documents at her conference table while she explained each line, and I read each line twice before signing it. No rushing, no performing unconcern. I read every word. What I received. 55% of the net equity in the house, reflecting my documented contributions to the down payment and renovation costs over 9 years, which, when the house sold in February, would come to just under $190,000 after the mortgage payoff. My full stake in the joint investment account, $63,000. An equitable share of Marcus's pension, calculated from the date of marriage. Full ownership of the car I'd been driving, which was titled jointly. And restitution, a formal legal term for the return of marital funds used for non-marital purposes, covering the transfers to Diane's apartment, 14 months, with interest. The total settlement placed me in a financial position better than I had projected in my best-case scenario. Marcus retained the business accounts he'd argued hardest for. He retained his own pension and a secondary investment account. He retained his car. He did not retain the house, and he did not retain the fiction that the marriage had dissolved through mutual and blameless incompatibility. The divorce was granted on grounds of marital misconduct. In Ohio, this has limited legal impact in itself, but significant weight in asset distribution, which is exactly how Patricia had used it. I signed the last page and put down the pen, and Patricia said, "That's it." I sat for a moment. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me with that same quiet competence she'd shown in our very first meeting. "You did the hard parts," she said. "I did the paperwork." I drove home, to the house that was still technically mine for another few months, while the sale processed, and I walked through every room. I did this slowly, not nostalgically, just looking. The living room where we'd watched movies. The kitchen where I'd stood at the window the night I found out and decided to think instead of cry. The home office where I'd written 3 pages of notes at 2 in the morning and encrypted them with a password he'd never know. I wasn't mourning. I was taking inventory. Marcus had moved the last of his belongings out the previous weekend, per the agreement's timeline. He hadn't asked to see me. I hadn't offered. The house felt like itself again. Not his, not ours. Mine, temporarily, before it became someone else's entirely. Diane had learned the terms of the settlement through family channels. My parents, who had been informed in broad strokes by me, personally, on a phone call I'd made the day before the agreement finalized. I told them clearly. The restitution clause meant that Marcus was formally acknowledged to have used marital funds to support Diane. My parents didn't respond immediately. There was a long silence on the phone, and then my father said, "We're sorry, Claire. For all of it." My mother couldn't speak. I didn't tell them what to do about Diane. That was their family relationship to manage. What I told them was that I was doing well, that I had been protected, and that they didn't need to worry about me. A week after the agreement was signed, I received a letter. Not a card this time. A full letter, 3 pages, handwritten. From Diane. I read the whole thing. She had been evicted from the Clintonville apartment when Marcus cut off the payments. He'd done it the day after the conference, apparently, and was staying with a friend. She said she was in therapy. She said she had no right to ask for anything. She said the last year had made her understand things about herself that she wished she'd understood at a cost that hadn't hurt me. I read it, and I folded it, and I put it with the photograph she'd sent, in the same drawer. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. Not out of anger, which had mostly burned down to something cooler and more complex by then. I didn't respond because I had said everything I needed to say, and because some doors, once closed, need to stay closed for a while, maybe longer than a while. What I had, at the end of it all, financial stability, a clean legal record, my career intact, my name on documents that would protect me for years. My own apartment, found in December. A 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I'd always liked, with good light and a balcony where I put a small table and 2 chairs, even though there was no one to sit in the second chair yet. The absence of the second chair occupant didn't feel like lack. It felt like space. It's been 18 months since I signed those papers. I still live in the apartment with the balcony. The second chair is occupied sometimes now. By Renata, who comes for wine on Friday evenings. By Jess, who visits twice a year from Portland. By a man named Daniel, who I've been seeing for about 6 months. He's an architect, which feels cosmically absurd, given where I work. He makes good coffee and doesn't leave his phone face down on tables. I noticed that. It mattered exactly as much as it should have. My career expanded. In the spring after the divorce, I was offered a senior director role at the firm, a position that had been quietly in conversation before the personal upheaval. I took it. The promotion came with a title change, an office with a window, and a number on my paycheck that made the settlement's financial projections look conservative. I started running again, something I'd let lapse years ago, and discovered that the particular silence of early morning miles was exactly the kind of silence I'd been craving. Clean, self-generated, belonging to no one else. 4 women from the support group kept meeting informally, dinner every couple of months. There is a specific quality to being known by people who understand what you've survived, which is different from sympathy and different from admiration. Something more like solidarity. I'd never quite had it before. My relationship with my parents was reshaped in ways I hadn't predicted. My father started calling on Sunday evenings, unprompted. not because of crisis. My mother struggled more. Diane is still her daughter. That complexity is real, and we navigate it carefully, neither of us pretending it isn't there. As for Marcus, the Hargrove contract was reviewed after the divorce proceedings generated documentation that crossed certain disclosure thresholds. He wasn't fired, but quietly moved sideways, out of the senior client role he'd held for 6 years, into a position that paid less and mattered less. He moved to a condo downtown. A colleague told me he'd changed, quieter, less certain of himself in rooms where he'd always moved with total ease. I felt something flat and honest when I heard this. Yes, that's what this costs. Diane had a harder year. The eviction, the cheaper sublet, the commercial photography work she'd always dismissed. She picked it up and survived on it. The relationship with Marcus ended the way relationships founded on deception tend to end when deception becomes expensive. He had used the language of love for 14 months. He used the language of self-preservation as soon as it cost him something. Diane learned the truth about what they had in a way that carried its own particular injury. I don't take pleasure in that. The disillusionment she earned. But the pain of it, that I understand as real, and I'm not built to enjoy real suffering, even in someone who wronged me. What I thought about most in those 18 months was a question Dr. Obi had posed early in our work together. Where do you think that capacity to hold still under pressure came from? I think I know now. It came from all the ordinary years, the careful records, the habit of thinking in sequences and consequences. I had always been the steady one, the reliable one. For years I'd wondered if that was a deficit. It turned out to be the thing that saved me. Be the person who thinks first. Document everything. Know your worth before someone tries to assign it for you. And never, never let the people who've already taken something from you take your clarity too. What would you have done, standing in that doorway? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, genuinely, for listening all the way to the end. Stories like this one only matter when someone's willing to hear them.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.